Putin's war, our energy crisis. Germany must end its dependency on fossil fuels. That's what the plan was anyway. Solar power has lots of potential. Or does nuclear power need to make a comeback?
Made in Germany. In 30 minutes on DW.
What's making the headlines and what's behind them?
DW News Africa.
The show that tackles the issues shaping the continent.
Life is slowly getting back to normal here.
We're on the streets to give you in-depth reports and insights.
Our correspondents on the ground reporting from across the continent.
All the trends that matter to you.
DW News Africa, every Friday on DW.
They've had no peace for 4 decades. The people of Iraq. Their country is devastated, and there's no end to the violence. How did it come to this? Key eyewitnesses reveal an unprecedented story.
He behaved exactly like Saddam Hussein, and the poison spread from there onwards.
Misery, misery, no more life.
The great documentary series, Iraq, Destruction of a Nation. This week on DW.
This is DW News live from Berlin. Ukraine's president makes an urgent appeal to the United States.
Ukrainian people are defending not only Ukraine. We are fighting for the values of Europe and the world.
In a virtual address to Congress, Volodymyr Zelensky asks for more sanctions and military support to fight Russia, telling Americans, "We need you now." Also on the program, Russia escalates its bombardment of Kiev. Ukraine says Russian forces are striking residential areas from positions outside the capital. And as NATO prepares a shake-up in its approach to security, we'll take you live to Brussels, where alliance defence ministers have been discussing new ways of deterring future Russian actions. I'm Phil Gale. Welcome to the programme. Volodymyr Zelensky has made an urgent and emotional appeal to the United States for more help in his country's war against Russia. In a virtual address to Congress, Ukraine's president repeated his plea for Western countries to increase their military involvement and invoked a key turning point in US history, telling Americans that Ukraine needs their help now.
Right now, the destiny of our country is being decided. The destiny of our people, whether Ukrainians will be free, whether they will be able to preserve their democracy. Russia has attacked not just us, not just our land, not just our cities. It went on a brutal offensive against our values, basic human values. It threw tanks and planes against our freedom, against our right to live freely in our own country, choosing our own future.
Well, DW's Washington Bureau Chief Ines Paul watched President Zelensky's speech and joins us now. Welcome, Ines. This was about hearts and minds, if I can put it that way. He hit lots of emotional points that particularly hit home to Americans. He tailored that speech to his audience.
Absolutely, Phil. He really understands how to reach a specific audience. I mean, we mustn't forget he's a trained comedian, and he really knows how, kind of which buttons to push to reach, as you say, the hearts and minds of the audience. And he did so. I mean, just by invoking all the tragedies in the American history, like the attack in Pearl Harbor or the 9/11 terrorist attack, with these images he invoked in the speech, he didn't reach only out to the lawmakers and politicians, but also to every single American. And on top of that, he played this very emotional video. So he also understands how to use images. So in a way, that was a very, very modern speech we just heard from President Zelensky.
And despite being told time and again that NATO would not impose a no-fly zone, he asked for it again, but he also asked for alternatives.
Right. I mean, he understands that there is no way that President Biden here in the United States would support this no-fly zone to protect Ukrainian civilians mainly, but that there is a window of opportunity that President Biden increases the amount of money he gives to Ukraine, and also that he might change his mind regarding delivering defense aircraft to the United States. And what we hear, these decisions are in the making. So, indeed, that's definitely something he wants to get out of today.
And it's not as though Washington is sitting on its hands in this. It is already providing extensive support to Ukraine.
Oh, millions and billions, absolutely. And it has from actually before the war started. I mean, there was no doubt that President Biden really prioritized this ongoing crisis there. And he worked hard with his administration also on diplomatic strategies and levels. He's planning to fly to Europe soon. So absolutely, this is absolutely a top priority of this administration right now here in the United States.
The United States are famously fractured at the moment. How united are Democrats and Republicans on this issue?
We haven't seen Republican and Democratic lawmakers so close together since, I probably can say, years. So this crisis really brings the political Washington together. But Phil, it is also true, the further away you go from the Capitol, the less support you see, especially when it comes to sanctions, which kind of backfire to the average American. We have to keep in mind we are experiencing super high inflation right now. Anyhow, it's up to 14–15% in some cities. The gas prices are skyrocketing and getting even higher with all the sanctions. So I just attended a Trump rally last weekend and talked to many Trump supporters, and they made it clear, for them, it's the biggest concern is really what is going on here in the United States. But having said this, I mean, after this speech, after this video clip, I'm sure President Zelensky was able to really reach out to many, many American hearts, as he really, really knows how to address his specific audience.
OK, so unanimity between the two sides of the aisle in Congress. How about amongst NATO allies? You mentioned there Joe Biden is due to travel to Europe next week to talk about this. Is everyone on the same page?
Well, we see that's the American perspective here. Leaders like the Polish leader sometimes talking about support which is not kind of supported by the American administration. They constantly, the American administration, President Biden and also Secretary of State Blinken, constantly stress the factor that they do not want to get NATO involved in this war, because they really fear that this might be the beginning of a third world war, that they do not want to send, and they will not send in soldiers into Ukraine. So this is really the red line here in the United States. But again, the United States are far away, and I think it's understandable that the closer you are to this war zone, the more likely you also are to kind of open up your mind to other possibilities. But there is no way that President Biden, however, will support a NATO involvement unless Vladimir Putin, unless the Russian military attacks a NATO country. That's also something Biden made crystal clear from the beginning on. If Russian military kind of hits 1 inch of NATO territory, the NATO then will strike back.
Right. And an attack on NATO territory, something the United States obviously taking very seriously as it escalates its troop numbers in the east, independent of the NATO contingent.
Right, so they absolutely take it seriously, and there is a big fear also here in the United States that Vladimir Putin, kind of the further he gets put into a corner, the more likely it is that he does something which probably doesn't really make sense, but which might really put the world in danger. And for that, the United States wants to be prepared. And as you just said and mentioned, they are increasing the military presence on the eastern border of Ukraine.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Ines. Ines Pohl in Washington. Top defence officials from NATO countries have been discussing further help for Ukraine as Kiev fights Russia's invasion. The leaders, including US Defence Secretary Lloyd, are meeting in Brussels. General Austin repeated that the alliance would abide by its promise to protect the Eastern European allies if Russia launched an attack. But Estonia, one of the smaller NATO allies bordering Russia, has continued to call for the alliance to set up a no-fly zone over Ukraine. This, as we've just been hearing, is a step the alliance has refused to take so far, fearing a full-scale war with Russia. Well, we're waiting to hear from NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg following that meeting. Ahead of that, we'll bring in DW correspondent Terry Schultz, who's at NATO headquarters. Welcome, Terry. What are we expecting to hear this afternoon?
We are not expecting to hear that NATO is going to change its position on a no-fly zone, for example, or even on the alliance as a whole sending lethal assistance to Ukraine. That's just not something that you'll ever get 30 countries to agree to. What Secretary-General Stoltenberg will talk about is how they have agreed to reinforce their own territory, to possibly send reinforcements to the eastern flank. He also told us yesterday that the alliance is going to start looking at longer-term plans to deal with what he calls the new normal, the fact that there will be an unstable situation in Europe now for we don't even know how long. And so NATO is going to adapt. He says that they're going to be, putting these troops in position in the Eastern allies for longer periods of time, possibly holding larger exercises, pre-positioning equipment, and strengthening air, sea, and cyber defenses as well. And in fact, all the things that Russian President Vladimir Putin said he would not accept, he has now certainly made come true.
Right. So we're talking about a significant increase in NATO forces on its eastern edges.
That's right. Secretary-General Stoltenberg talks about hundreds of thousands more troops on alert throughout Europe. That's countries' national militaries being on alert, as well as the additional, he says, 100,000 troops the United States now has based in Europe with the additions it sent with Russia's military buildup. So absolutely, there is, you've never seen a stronger NATO military force than you have today in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
And this is because NATO fears what? NATO fears that Russia won't stop at Ukraine and is likely to encroach on NATO territory? Or is this a sort of, a deterrent posture?
Well, they certainly hope it's a deterrent, and NATO reminds all the time to the heartbreak of the Ukrainians that it is responsible for protecting NATO territory. That goes as far as the Baltic states, as far as Poland, but it does not go into Ukraine. So that is, in fact, NATO's responsibility, and it would say it's been very effective so far in stopping Russian President Vladimir Putin from thinking he can come into NATO territory. At the same time, what we saw happen in Ukraine, which was against many longtime Russia watchers' expectations, has made clear that you don't know what Putin is going to do. You have no idea how far he'll go. So what they look at now is what he's capable of doing. What kind of forces has he amassed? What kind of nuclear capabilities does he have? They don't know what he will do. They only know what he can do. And that's what they need to guard against.
All right, thank you for that. Terry Schultz at NATO headquarters. We're expecting to hear from the NATO Secretary-General in the next half hour or so. If that happens in our time, we'll bring that to you live and talk to you again then. Thank you. Right now, though, we'll return to the situation in Kiev, where Russia is escalating its attacks across the country. Now, Russian forces are reported to be stepping up their bombardment of the Ukrainian capital and intensifying the fighting in the city's suburbs. Emergency services say at least 2 people were injured in new strikes on the capital this morning.
For residents of the Ukrainian capital, every passing day brings further shelling, more homes lost, and more casualties. Is she alive? Yes, she's alive. Get her in the car. A citywide curfew was imposed on Tuesday and will last until Thursday morning. Ahead of the curfew, people rushed to the stores to stock up on food and supplies. The situation in the city is not bad. People are holding up. We're supported by the volunteers and the territorial defense. Meanwhile, President Volodymyr Zelensky said he saw hope for compromise in talks between Russia and Ukraine, even as Moscow stepped up its assault.
It is important. It's difficult, but important, because any war ends in an agreement. Meetings continue. As I'm told, the positions in the negotiations sound more realistic. However, there still needs to be more time for decisions to be in Ukraine's interests.
On Tuesday, leaders from 3 EU countries visited Kiev, bringing a message of support. They reiterated their desire to give Ukraine a way to join the EU as soon as possible.
I hope it should be agreed over the next couple of days or weeks, and the candidate status should be given till the end of this year at the latest. Thank you.
The capital bracing for the next round. This medical team has set up a field hospital in a bomb shelter for the worst-case scenario of having to treat the wounded here. The people of Kiev know their ordeal is far from over.
Let's take you to Ukraine then and join DW's Alexandra von Namen, who's in Lviv in the west of the country. Welcome, Alexandra. Let's start with the intensification of the fighting and shelling in and around the capital. What are you hearing?
So what we know is that heavy fighting is taking place on the outskirts of Kiev. And according to Ukraine officials, the Ukrainian forces there, and this is quite interesting, have started their own counter-offensive, their counter-attacks on Russian troops there. The goal is not so much to win back territory, but the goal is apparently to inflict mass casualties on the Russian army. And when we talk about the city itself, it is under curfew that was announced yesterday. So with its mayor calling on all residents to seek shelter. We know that there were explosions in the city center. There are reports that an apartment building was hit by Russian missiles with people trapped there, with apartments on fire, and first responders who rushed to the building to get the people out this morning.
And you're there in Lviv, a region where people had been fleeing to for safety, but the situation there has become more dangerous over recent days.
Yes, and people told me, many people I've been talking with, that they are afraid that it's just a question of time before the war comes here as well. Just a few days ago, Russian missiles struck military infrastructure and international training center just about 30 kilometers away from Lviv, so people are now scared. And we also had this morning an air raid alarm twice, so there is this sense that it's maybe also not safe here. However, we have to say that it's been quiet so far in the last days, and this is of course very important. We are not only having residents who still are in Lviv, but also many refugees who are here to stay after fleeing the fighting in eastern part of Ukraine, or who want to travel on to cross the border to Poland and to other European nations.
And President Zelensky addressed the US Congress today, saying this is a crucial moment for his country. What did he mean by that?
Well, he said that this is a moment right now, that this is a moment where the destiny of his...
And that was me speaking to Alexandra von Norman in Lviv a little earlier. Let's cross to NATO headquarters, where Jens Stoltenberg has begun to speak.
Our defences now and for the years to come. Our close partners Finland, Sweden and Georgia and the European Union joined us for the first session. And Ukrainian Defence Minister Oleksiy Reznikov described in stark terms the death and destruction caused by President Putin's war. The determined resistance of the Ukrainians against the invasion, and the importance of our continued support. We all paid tribute to the courage of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian armed forces. NATO allies and partners have supported Ukraine with equipment and training for many years. We are helping Ukraine to uphold its fundamental right to self-defense, freedom and democracy, with significant amounts of critical military equipment. Today, ministers agreed that we must continue to provide significant support to Ukraine, including with military supplies, financial help and humanitarian aid. NATO allies and partners are also hosting millions of Ukrainian refugees. President Putin must stop this war immediately, withdraw his forces now, and engage in diplomacy in good faith. NATO is responding to this crisis with speed and unity. And next week, allied heads of state and government will meet for an extraordinary NATO summit. We will address both our immediate response and the changes we need to make for our longer-term security. Moscow should be in no doubt. NATO will not tolerate any attack on allied sovereignty or territorial integrity. We have already activated our defence plans to shield the alliance, increase our readiness and deploy troops from both sides of the Atlantic. There are now hundreds of thousands of forces at heightened alert across the alliance, 100,000 US troops in Europe, and around 40,000 troops under direct NATO command, mostly in the eastern part of the alliance, backed by major air and naval power, as well as air defences. But we face a new reality for our security, so we must reset our collective defence and deterrence for the longer term. Today, we tasked our military commanders to develop options across all domains: land, air, sea, cyber and space. On land, our new posture should include substantially more forces in the eastern part of the alliance, at higher readiness, with more pre-positioned equipment and supplies. In the air, more allied air power and strengthened integrated air and missile defense. At sea, carrier strike groups, submarines, and significant numbers of combat ships on persistent basis. We will also consider the future of our cyber defenses and how best to draw on allied space assets. We should also train and exercise more often and in greater numbers. Major increases to our deterrence and defense will require major investments. Allies need to invest a minimum of 2% of GDP on defense. And I welcome that allies such as Germany and Denmark have already made important announcements on more investments and faster timetables. We also need to spend more together. NATO common funding is the essential enabler that allows us to work together. It is a force multiplier for national defense efforts, and it shows solidarity as allies. At this critical moment for our security, unity between North America and Europe in NATO is more important than ever. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
Okay, we'll start with BBC in the center, just behind. Thank you. Last row. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Secretary-General. Could I just ask you, we've heard once again from President Zelensky addressing US Congress, calling for a no-fly zone. Are there any allies at all who have been asking for one, even if the decision of the alliance as a whole is not to enforce one? Has there been any discussion at all about it? And the second question I have is just about Ukraine and its NATO membership. Do you believe that Ukraine has cooled towards its view of joining NATO as a negotiating tool with the hope of eventually reaching some kind of agreement with Russia? Thank you very much.
Allies are united, both in providing support to Ukraine to uphold the right for self-defense, but allies are also united when it comes to that NATO should not deploy forces on the ground or in the airspace over Ukraine. Because we have a responsibility to ensure that this conflict, this war, doesn't escalate beyond Ukraine. We see death, we see destruction, we see human suffering in Ukraine, but this can become even worse if NATO took actions that actually turned this into a full-fledged war between NATO and Russia. So allies are united when it comes to the issue of how to provide support to Ukraine. Ministers addressed this today. They reinforced the message of the importance of providing support with equipment, advanced equipment, air defense systems, anti-tank weapons and many other types of support, but no NATO deployment of air or ground capabilities in Ukraine, and that's the united position from NATO allies. Then the message to Ukraine is the same now as it has been for years, that Ukraine is a sovereign, independent nation. It has its own right to choose its own path, and we respect the decisions made by the democratic elected government by Ukraine. So it's up to them to decide whether they aspire for NATO membership or not, and then it's up for 30 allies to decide on that issue. Not for Russia to try to veto such a process.
CNN.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary-General. Natasha Bertram, CNN. I'm wondering whether NATO has invited President Zelensky to participate in any way in the Leaders Summit next week, as Reznikov did in the Defense Ministerial today. And I'm also wondering if you could respond to the Polish proposal to send NATO forces into Ukraine on a so-called peacekeeping mission. Thanks.
So what we need is peace in Ukraine, and therefore Russia and President Putin has to stop the war, withdraw its forces. We support all efforts to find a negotiated solution. We support all efforts to find a diplomatic solution. And of course we support and welcome the talks and negotiations which are now taking place between Ukraine and Russia. At the same time we support Ukraine because we know what they can achieve on the negotiating table is of course very closely linked to the situation on the battlefield. So I strongly also believe that one of the reasons why the Ukrainians also are saying that they have seen some steps in the right direction is because they have been able to fight back. They have been able to fight back against the invading Russian forces. So the courage, the determination and the support from NATO allies to the Ukrainian armed forces is extremely important also when it comes to what they can achieve as part of the negotiated process with Russia. Again, of course, we support peace efforts. We call on Russia and President Putin to withdraw its forces, but we have no plans of deploying NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine.
Okay, Rai.
Secretary General, good evening. Can you comment on Italy's role in this current crisis? And happy birthday for today.
Thank you. I would very much like to comment on Italy's role. Italy is a highly valued NATO ally, a founding member, and Italy is contributing to our collective defense in many different ways. I was recently in Romania. I met Italian pilots. They are helping there to keep NATO airspace safe, and they really show commitment and strength in their contributions to different NATO missions and operations, including in Kosovo, where Italy has been a key ally for many, many years.
Financial Times. Yeah, gentleman with glasses. Yeah.
Thank you. Just to follow up to the question about the peace talks, you said that you're encouraged by signs and that you support any effort to find a diplomatic solution. Could you tell us, are you seeing any signs on the ground that the Russians are genuine in their approach to these peace talks, or that they may well just be using them as a distraction for resupply and for restructuring their approach? Thank you.
On the ground, we don't see any sign. And that's the reason why we also call on Russia to engage in these talks in good faith. And it's not for me to report from these talks. NATO are not part of those talks. These are talks between Ukraine and Russia. But I've just seen the reports coming out from those talks. I think it's very important not to speculate and not to prejudge or to preempt any outcome of these talks. But my message was in a way that it is obvious that what Ukraine can achieve around the negotiating table is very closely linked to the situation on the battleground, and therefore the support we give to them to stand up against and to resist the Russian invasion also helps them to achieve an acceptable outcome in the negotiations.
Associated Press.
Lorne Cook from the Associated Press. Could you tell me a little bit more about the tasking that you've given NATO commanders, what that might involve? And are we looking ahead 1 year, or are we talking about a decade, something longer term? And you also used the word persistent. I wonder what that means. Why wouldn't you say on a permanent basis?
This is the way we make these kind of decisions in NATO, is that the politicians, they set out the guidelines, the direction, then we task our military commanders to give advice on how to follow up, and then we make final decisions as politicians based on these advice and input from our military commanders. This was exactly the same we did back in 2016. when we, at the Warsaw Summit, made historic decisions for the first time in our history to deploy NATO combat troops to the eastern part of the alliance. You have to remember that before Ukraine, also before the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 by Russia, NATO had no combat troops in the eastern part of the alliance. Then we had the illegal annexation of Crimea, and since 2014 we have implemented the biggest reinforcement of collective defense since the end of the Cold War, tripling the size of the NATO response force.
Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary-General, holding a press conference following the meeting of NATO defence ministers, taking a few questions, essentially repeating his stance that there would be no air support from NATO, no no-fly zone over Ukraine, and that NATO was increasing its capabilities on land, sea, air, cyber and space. Now, we'll continue our coverage of what's going on in this war that Russia has launched against Ukraine. Looking at the money, is Russia on the edge of insolvency? The ratings agency Fitch says there is an immediate risk of default. A bond payment of more than $100 million is due today. If Russia were to make that payment in rubles, it could trigger a technical default.
Western sanctions hit the Russian economy hard. Many banks have been excluded from the global payment system SWIFT, and a big chunk of state assets have been frozen. While Russia has dollar reserves of $640 billion, the country's central bank